The ayes have it.
Employment Allocation of Tips Bill, not amended in Public Bill Committee, to be considered.
No amendments on consideration. Third reading, what day? Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the Employment Allocation of Tips Bill be now read a third time. This bill, which going forwards I will call the Tipping Bill, is an important measure which I'm very glad we have time today to debate. The Tipping Bill has a simple message: to promote fairness and to promote transparency, to ensure that workers receive the tips they earn. This will create a level playing field for businesses who are already passing on tips to workers in a fair and transparent way. It will create confidence for consumers who will know that the full value of the tip that they give will go to the workers. I would like to thank Minister Hollinrake and the Government for supporting this bill. I'm delighted for the bill to be at a third reading with Government and cross-party support. I would also like to thank the Right Honourable Member for Watford for his earlier work on this bill. He has been instrumental in bringing this important piece of legislation to the forefront. The bill would not be where it is today without his determination and his hard work. When the member asked if I would take the bill over from him, I was honoured. I have experienced firsthand the importance of tips, and like many young people, I financed my sixth form and university studies by working in cafes and pubs. My constituency of Ynysmore is very dependent on the hospitality and tourism sector, which is also one of the largest sectors in Wales. So this is an opportunity to help and support those that work in the tourism and hospitality sector, which has one of the lowest hourly rates of pay and at a particularly difficult time. It is estimated that this bill will benefit around 1 million workers in the sector, with a financial benefit of around £200 each year. With the cost of living at the front of a lot of people's minds, this bill will help those workers who are wrongly not receiving the money that they're due from the tips that they have earned. In sectors such as hospitality and beauty services, customers recognise and reward good service and hard work through tips, gratuities and service charges, and I will refer to these collectively as tips. The customer expects 100% of the tips they leave to go to the workers, and we already know that this is happening in most businesses where tips are passed on to staff in full. However, we know that there are some unscrupulous employers who exploit staff by retaining some or even all of the tips that the workers earn. And this goes against the assumption that the large majority of customers have, that 100% of the tips that they have given will end up in the pockets of the workers. Of course I'll give way.
Grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. She's absolutely right. Customers expect 100% of the tips will go to the staff. Does she also agree with me that people, when they go to work in hospitality, will also make that assumption that any tips they get will be theirs to earn, and that they may make a decision that the wage that may not be very high that they're going to get will at least be supplemented by them being able to earn what they do with their service?
May I thank the honourable member from Wantage for his intervention, and he makes a very, very good point that when people, especially young people, when they're looking at getting a part-time job or getting a job in the sector, or anyone that's looking to get employment in the hospitality sector, they're looking at it as the whole package. What does this mean for them? Will they be able to earn enough? So this is a vital part of their calculation when they're looking at taking these roles. Likewise, workers expect the tips that have been given in recognition of their hard work and good customer service to be given to them in full. This bill promotes fairness for workers by creating a legal obligation to pass on tips to workers in full with no deductions other than in very limited circumstances, such as those required under law. And this bill provides protection across all sectors, but is focused on changing employment law to bring increased protection for workers in industries where tipping is common. An additional benefit to this legislation is the increased confidence consumers will have that the tips that they choose to leave in recognition of good service are actually going to the workers they are intended for and not being pocketed unfairly by bosses. In determining how to allocate tips fairly, the employer must have regard to the relevant provisions of the upcoming statutory code of practice. The Code of Practice will set out principles of fairness and transparency relating to tips. The Code of Practice is necessary to help describe different circumstances that are likely to be fair and unfair in more detail than a bill could. A number of examples will be provided to illustrate what fair tipping practices look like. These examples are not included in the bill itself, as this could limit flexibility for employers. To issue a code of practice, the Secretary of State must consult ACAS and publish a draft to allow stakeholders to make representations before laying the draft before both Houses of Parliament for approval. This code of practice will be statutory and have legal effect, which means that it can be introduced in employment tribunals as evidence when considering whether an employer is in breach of this legislation. There is one main theme that runs through the core of this bill, and that is the creating of the legal obligation on employers to pass on tips to workers in full. Giving workers 100% of tips means that there can be no deductions from tips from an employer, other than in the limited circumstances required or permitted by other law, including tax law. Prohibited deductions include, but are not limited to, card transaction fees and administration costs. Some employers may use a trunk system to be able to help with distributing tips. This is a system that is mostly used in the hospitality sector, where an employer delegates the collection, allocation, and distribution of tips to a person or persons known as a trunk master or trunk operator. It's important that we retain flexibility for employers to choose how to distribute tips, so long as that distribution is fair. Transparency is a crucial part of this bill, and information plays a significant role. In whichever way tips are allocated to workers, this bill provides these workers with a new right to make a written request to access the relevant parts of their employer's tipping records. This allows workers to gather evidence to seek redress if they are not being treated fairly, and workers will then be able to bring forward a claim to an employment tribunal where necessary. The bill will be enforced by workers through the employment tribunal system and provides employment tribunals with remedies in situations where an employer has made deductions from tips or not allocated tips in a fair and transparent way. Workers will be able to present complaints to an employment tribunal that an employer has failed to comply with their obligation to allocate tips fairly or failed to do so in time. This also allows agency workers to present complaints. The limitation period for these complaints is 12 months. Workers' rights to bring forward these claims are at the core of this bill, as employment rights need to be underpinned by effective enforcement. The tribunal can make a range of orders, including an order requiring the employer to revise any allocation of tips that they have made, or an order requiring the employer to make a payment to a worker of up to £5,000 to compensate them for consequential financial loss. This will help those workers who have not been fairly treated when tips have been distributed. This bill will have a limited impact on employers who already handle tips fairly and transparently. It is not expected that there will be significant change or cost to business to comply with the new rules. Employers will still have flexibility on how to design their tipping policies, how to maintain records, and how they communicate their policies to workers. In addition to this, when workers request information, they have a period of 4 weeks to fulfil this request. I would like to conclude by giving a final overview of the bill. This tipping bill sets out the right that tips should go to the workers who earn them, and that these tips should be distributed both fairly and with transparency.
Would my honourable friend give way?
It'd be my pleasure to give way.
I'm grateful to her for giving way as she nears the end of her speech, and where she's made a very powerful case on behalf of workers who have been missing out on their tips up to now. I really am keen to see people knowing about this bill, workers, and also those people like us who will go into a restaurant or a place to eat or to have a drink and say, will you keep the tips? They need to know for sure that they will be able to keep the tip, and I think a media campaign to support this is something which would really be helpful.
Thank you. The honourable member makes a fantastic intervention and a fantastic suggestion, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us and the sector. And we've got the likes of Kate Nichols at UK Hospitality. We've got the support of the unions. There are so many people that are really right behind this bill, supporting these workers that play a vital role in such an important sector. So we will be seeing this communicated, and I think it's important that people know that in this House. And I think these Fridays are very, very special, as the honourable member from Watford has previously stated, that this is an opportunity for us to put in place legislation that is really standing up for the rights of the workers. So I'll end by saying, as we're all aware, the process of taking a private member's bill through the House is a fragile process, and I'm thankful for all members of the House for working together to make sure that this bill reaches final reading within this House before progressing to the Lords. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the government again, especially ministers at base, for supporting this bill and the support of members of this House whilst this bill has been moving through the stages of the second reading, committee stage, and now finally the third reading. I believe firmly that this bill gives us all a great opportunity to bring about real change, which will see an impact for workers who receive tips across all of our constituencies.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. Matt Runner.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and may I commend the work of the Honourable Member for Ynys Môn. I hope I pronounced your constituency correctly, for her work on this very important issue, which clearly affects hundreds of thousands of young people, many people on low incomes across the country, and we appreciate your work on it. I would also like to pay tribute to the member for Watford, other members from across the House, and indeed to the GMB for their excellent work on campaigning on this issue for many, many years. Indeed, I think possibly for 10 or 15 or 20 years on this matter. I just wanted to briefly point out how important this issue is to my own constituents in Reading and Woodley. In any large town, we have a huge number of pubs, bars, cafes, and the volume of tips being given is quite considerable, and it's very important that people working in those establishments are able to benefit from those tips. And I thought it was fascinating and very important to hear the point being made earlier about the average benefit to workers on relatively modest incomes around the country of £200 a year. And quite clearly, at the time of the current cost of living crisis, that's a very valuable contribution to somebody's income, even if it is obviously spread out over a long period of time. And I do want to point out that I am aware of some people in the hospitality sector and other similar sectors, I should say, being amongst those who may have to resort to food banks to support themselves. So I do hope that this bill will actually make a significant difference to their income over the coming year. Just finally, I would like to once again thank the Honourable Member for her work, and I can clearly see that in areas with a large hospitality industry such as coastal or tourist areas, this is a particularly important matter. I also wanted to add that it does matter a lot in towns with major shopping centres or university towns like Reading, and to us as well it is important, and I once again thank her for her work and the work of others from across the House. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Dean Russell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I stand here today a very happy man, but with a certain trepidation, because I do know the fragility of private members' bills even at these stages. I would just like to begin by again thanking the current Minister on the bench and predecessors from my short period of time in the role for making sure that this bill is here today and has government support. I would particularly like to thank my honourable friend from Ynys Môn for the work that she's done. To reuse a phrase slightly incorrectly, but I think it's true in this case, she took this bill when I spoke to her about it, and she took the bill by the horns and made sure that we took this forward in a way that would get here today. And the truth is, when I was looking for somebody to take over this private member's bill when I had my period as a minister, I couldn't think of a better person in the UK, or potentially even the world, who would get behind this bill, because hospitality, I know, is so important to her constituents and to her constituency, and really the power to make sure that this has got through to this stage is incredible, and she has been not just an ambassador for this, but championed it in a way that I think not many could have done the same level of work to. I'll speak shortly about the purpose of the bill and how it came about, because I think it's important to recognise why this is so important. Because for many years, I think many of us have been in restaurants or in places where one would give a tip, and we often end the conversation as we hand over the money or put money into a tip jar or pay on a credit card machine with the phrase, "Are you sure you're going to get this? Will you get this tip? Will your team get this tip?" And it's become part of the national conversation whenever giving a tip, this lack of surety about whether actually it will reach the people who have been serving or been cooking or been offering those services. And this bill will help end that question. We will no longer need that, and the members of staff will no longer need to worry that they won't receive it. And the birth of this, as rightly has been mentioned just now in the excellent previous speech, is that this isn't something where I came up with it. It's been really gestating in government and within society for many, many years. And I recall last year, I think it was in May 2022, Quentin Letts wrote a very humorous, as typically humorous and incredibly well-spoken piece about snollygosters, I think it was, about how snollygosters in the machine and in the system often slow down good government policy and actually stop really positive law going through, whereas other laws, perhaps sometimes to raise taxes, and that's no dig at anyone, it can go through much quicker. And actually this has been in the system for many, many years. And I think what we've seen here through the Private Members Bill and through the work of government and through really standing on the shoulders of giants is the fact that when the right thing needs to be done, it does get done eventually. And I think the power of this bill is that it provides surety in many ways. So first of all, what it means is that 100% of the tip goes to the workers. Now, how that gets divided, and there'll be a piece of work after, hopefully this does become law, in terms of a code of practice with a bunch of scenarios for different organisations to refer to as part of the tribunal process and so on, and to make sure that they're shared fairly. But at the heart of that 100% is the word fairness. Because this is about fairness. This is about knowing that the money you're giving is going to the people you've given it to. The people that get it know that they're getting it, but also making sure that there isn't a way there's any room for manoeuvre on this. You know, it's as simple as it gets, 100%. And the fairness bit, I think, is absolutely key. Because what this isn't about is topping up salaries. And it's very clear in the bill. And it was part of the work in the early stages with the fantastic civil servants as well. To make it absolutely clear, this isn't about saying you can suddenly reduce the minimum wage and use tips to top up people's salaries. A tip is a gratuity. It's a thank you. It's in addition to. It's not about trying to use it as salaries. But I do totally appreciate, as has been mentioned earlier, that for many who go into the hospitality sector, the tip is part of what they will see as income, but it should never be used to replace a salary. It should never be used just to top it up. It should be a thank you in addition to that and a bonus to help those who work in that sector. Now, in Watford, one of the reasons why I was so passionate about bringing this private members bill in, after trying previously as a presentation bill, so this was my actually a second attempt, was that in Watford we have some fantastic hospitality organisations. We've got new organisations like the Beach House, older establishments like Tabouche, L'Artista, the Essex Arms, Rhubarb Cafe, many, and I could list many of them. But they all have a common thread, that they rely on people to come and work in those places, to work in hospitality, to wait on tables, to cook. And it relies also on customers to know they're going to have a fantastic experience and be grateful enough to want to give a tip at the end. And what I found during the pandemic was fascinating, because everywhere that we went, both in my role as an MP, but also as someone who lives in Watford, when going out, we noticed that everywhere during the pandemic wasn't taking cash, or most places weren't. So increasingly, it was a payment by credit card. And again, the question was, what does that 12.5% service charge actually mean? Does that go to staff? Is that just for businesses to make a bit more money? And no one really, in most places, most people you speak to, couldn't really give an answer. What is it actually for? Do you then give a tip on top of the credit card charge or not? And what this bill will do will make sure that it's absolutely clear. If it's a service charge, if it's a tip, if it's a gratuity, it will go to the staff. And what it will mean for businesses is that what I've heard, because I have heard people say, well, isn't this an extra burden? Burden's been used as a word a lot recently this week in debates when it comes to legislation on business. Actually, this isn't a burden for businesses. Most businesses do the right thing. Most businesses give the tips to their staff, and it's absolutely part of what they do, because many people, especially in the hospitality industry, grew up working in hospitality, and therefore they've had tips in the past, and they know how important it is to their staff to keep those. But there are a few businesses, including, sadly, some very large franchises from reports I've read in the past, who don't make sure that staff get those tips. And so, actually, for the vast majority of very good businesses who give the tips across, they see this as a positive, not an extra burden, because they say, well, actually, it creates a level playing field. For business, it means that they know that other organisations can't make extra profit out of the back pockets and the wallets of people who work for them. Because not only is that utterly wrong, but also it changes and games the system towards those who are doing bad practice versus those who actually are doing the right thing. And that, again, is another important part around the word fairness with this bill. So I won't talk for too long, because I would love to talk for hours, because it's been a process of many ups and downs, at times feeling that beating heart of thinking, are we going to get this through? Is it going to actually happen? So I want to speak for as short a time as possible to make sure we get to that point that hopefully we can pass this through and move to the Lords. But I'd just like to finally make a point on this about workers' rights. This is at the heart of this is about workers' rights. At the heart of this is about the young people in society, many of which who work in hospitality. But it's also about this place coming together. I always think Friday debates are perhaps the most powerful ones, because it's where we're all usually in some form of agreement, and the politics stays out of it, or the sort of party politics, point-scoring politics. And we've seen that again with this bill as it's passed through this place. What we've seen is members coming together, many of which who've worked in hospitality when they were younger, who've had experience with that, or have businesses in their own patch, or staff in their own patch that have tips and gratuities and work in this place. But I think this is an example that if we can get this through today, and I urge all colleagues to please support it, if we can get this through today, and I say to the other place to please support it as well, if we get this through, it's going to make a difference to so many people, not just the million that's been quoted, but their friends, their families, to the industry to get more people to want to work in it or stay in it, to the businesses who know that they're working on a level playing field, and for this place to show that actually it does take time sometimes to get the legislation through. It does sometimes get utterly frustrating, and the snollygosters, I think it was, again, sometimes it looks like they might be winning, as Quentin Letts pointed out, but actually eventually you do get to the right, or one does get to the right place. And I think today, if we can get this through today, I will be really pleased, but so will society. So thank you to the ministers, thank you to the fantastic civil service and civil servants, and definitely a huge thank you to my colleague from Ynys Môn for the work that she's done. Thank you.
Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. May I begin by saying what a pleasure it is to follow my honourable friend, the member for Watford, who has been such a pivotal architect of this bill. And I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Ynys Môn, for getting this bill to this stage, for taking it on and being such a powerful advocate for the bill and for the people who will benefit from it. I would also like to recognise my honourable friend, the member for Watford, who had originally introduced it to the House, for his work, because a lot of this work was done previously by him as well, and this is really what you can call a great double act. I was pleased to support the bill at its second reading and through its committee stage. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill supports our government's commitment to ensuring fairness for workers by making sure tips are fairly distributed. Now, while there are many good employers who ensure that staff receive their fair share of tips and are open about that sharing, we know that this isn't always the case. As I previously mentioned in this House, many of my constituents got in touch with me about this very thing, reporting that they had had as much as 15% of their tips removed from their pay packet, and often they simply weren't aware of how much was being taken away from their pay packet, because often customers do leave a tip on a card. Well, when customers leave a tip, whether they do and how much they leave is determined in large part by the quality of service provided. And we want to be assured that these tips go to the person who provided that service. As has been said, this isn't a part of their wage. This is an extra, a thank you, a recognition for the service. And to be honest, many customers won't give a tip or will give a lower tip if the service that they get isn't that great. But they want to know whatever they give goes to the person who has given them the service in the first place. I also know that many people, as has been mentioned, are concerned about how they go about leaving a tip. Do they leave cash? Is it better to give the person cash when they have had a great meal or great service? That question that's so rightly asked that we all say, will you get this? Will you get this in full? But we know, as has been said, that many people will just add it onto their card when the bill comes. It astounds me how few people carry around cash in their pockets now. So this really has become commonplace. And many people are distrustful, understandably, that a tip left by card will actually reach the intended employee in full. And indeed, the Honourable Member for Watford noted at second reading, there's no guarantee that the person or the team they gave it to would receive it. For employees, tips by cards are less visible and they're difficult to track and claim. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is the world that we're in, and so navigating it and making things work is part of our job. And this bill will put an end to these concerns by amending the Employment Rights Act 1996 to place a legal obligation on employers to not only ensure tips, gratuities and service charges are distributed to staff, but to do so in full, without deductions, when these are being distributed, whether these are being distributed by the employer or via a trunk system. And I think it may be important, and an interesting point was raised by my honourable friend, the member for Watford, when he talked about the system by which these tips are distributed. That 12.5% service charge. What does it really mean? Where's it going to go? And I do wonder whether it might be an idea that we should put into the minds of hospitality, that perhaps they should set out whether they are running a trunk system and also set out next to that 12.5%. This will be distributed and given directly to the people who have provided the service to you today. And so, as has been mentioned, despite COVID, and we know that this was a difficult time for hospitality businesses, but many of them have bounced back and bounced back well. Some even flourished within my constituency. And this is often, in large part, due to members of staff providing great service, combined with the loyalty of their customers. And tips help to show workers that their good service is valued and appreciated. And customers should be able to show this appreciation with confidence. So while we should not need a law which obliges employers to allocate all tips, gratuities and service charges without deductions, sadly, it is very clear that we do. For my constituents working in Cheadle, in hospitality, this will be a welcome change. And may I just comment on a part of this bill which perhaps hasn't been spoken about so far in detail, and that's other areas where this will apply, such as the beauty industry. It's often an overlooked area. We tend to talk about it, this tips and tipping from the point of view of hospitality, restaurants, pubs and bars. But there are many people in nail bars and in other areas where tips will be left. And it is great to know that they will get the tips too. And we really would encourage the Minister to back this bill up with a sound and a good outreach of media coverage. And so I welcome this bill. I congratulate the Honourable Member for Anismond for bringing it forward. It will be a welcome change, and I'm pleased and hope that it will receive cross-party support.
David Johnston.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I think, like lots of people, I was very surprised when I discovered that tips were not being passed on. I think our understanding has always been that you pay the amount of money on the menu for the food if you're in a restaurant, and the additional money you leave is about the service that you receive. We've all given particularly generous tips when we've had very good service. I dare say we may have given not so good, maybe no tip for particularly bad service, though never in the constituency, obviously, partly because there'd never be any bad service in my constituency, I hasten to add. So it sticks in the craw to think that someone may have worked so hard and then see no benefit of that hard work, that it would just be taken by the owner of the business. And particularly, there are peak periods like Christmas, for example, where the amount that is earned in tips can be a vital boost to the person's income for that month, maybe even for that year.
Would the honourable gentleman give way?
I will.
I'd like to thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. And in terms of the point he makes about being surprised that this is an issue, and I totally accept that, has he, in terms of the tipping that he's done or people he knows, has he come across the issue of the difficulty sometimes? Do you put it onto the credit card or do you give it in cash? And obviously, if it goes onto the credit card, how likely is it to get to the employee? Perhaps even less likely. Is that an issue that he's given a great deal of thought to?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention. At first, I thought he was going to ask me how much I leave in tips. So I was a bit concerned there. Obviously, I'm a very generous tipper. In case he does want to know. But I think
I'm very intrigued, Mr. Speaker, by my honourable friend's use of the word generous, as he describes himself as a generous tipper, and perhaps he could tell the House what he considers in percentage terms a generous tip.
Well, I'm even more grateful to that honourable friend for asking me that question. I think what I would say is I am probably not quite as generous as they are in the US, where now you get recommendations on your bill for sometimes 25-30% as a tip. But I would always err on the side of giving a good tip, even for average service, and an even better one for exceptional service.
Thank you. I very much appreciate him giving way. Just on that point, though, about US service, I think one of the comments I've had to me, and I'm sure the honourable friend from this morning has had similar ones, which is this moving us, is the tips are moving us towards a sort of US model? And I think the really important thing to note is that, again, as was stated earlier, this isn't about making tips part of the salary. It's, we want workers to have good salaries. Minimum wage has been increased again in announcements. It's about the top-up. It's the thank you. It's the gratuity on top to say thank you, rather than it being seen as part of a salary, which I think is something that's come up a few times. Thank you.
I think my honourable friend makes a couple of very important points. I mean, the first one about the US is it was a particularly bad practice where employers were using tips to try and meet the minimum wage. And we've made great strides in increasing the national minimum wage in national living wage in recent years. I think we've now hit £10.40, although the minister can correct me on that, or at least £10, I believe. So I think that's one particularly important thing. But the other thing is, if when we go into a restaurant and we buy a pizza and it says £10, that pizza's £10, and the member of staff, when we paid for that pizza, said, you know what, I'm going to take £2 of that £10 for the pizza. I'm just going to keep that for myself. There would be outrage about that. There would be outrage about the reverse situation. And it's right that we should feel very offended on behalf of staff who are working hard for these tips and not getting them. Now, I think my honourable friend, the member for Cheadle, is absolutely right. This is not just about hospitality, and I thought she made a very important point about nail bars, hairdressers, lots of things that I have many of in my constituency. But I do realise it is in large part about hospitality. I have a constituency with a lot of hospitality venues, pubs, for example. There are only 7 MPs in this place who have more pubs in their constituencies than I do. I've been trying to get round them all. I'm doing pretty well. And hospitality is an industry which is vital for the UK economy, but it's an industry that's particularly vital for younger workers, for ethnic minority workers. It's for part-time workers. It's a very accessible industry for people to get their foot on the ladder, to get some important skills, and it's hard work. Often involving being on your feet all day, can be in very difficult conditions, can be dealing with very difficult customers. You may have long hours. And so it's vital, it's hard, you get good skills, and you should get all of your tips. Now, I should say that those employers, and I think people who've said this already are absolutely right, it is a small minority of employers that will be doing this, because most employers will feel like we do, that of course their staff should be given the tips for the work that they've done. So it will be a small minority. And they are shooting themselves in the foot in many ways, because where an employee has choice, and of course they don't always have choice, but where they have choice between different employers, chances are they're going to pick the one that's going to let them keep their tips rather than the one that won't let them keep their tips. And that would be a perfectly logical decision to make. It would probably be the decision that I made, because as we discussed earlier, just as the customer expects that the tip will go to the staff, I think staff think that wage may not be very high, but I'll be able to earn even more when it comes to tips. And this debate and this legislation reminded me of 2 other things which I think are relevant to this discussion and the passage of this legislation. And the first is unpaid internships. Now, the reason I say that is because the hope with this legislation was that employers would not wait for the legislation to take effect, and they would start to change their practices before the statutory code came into effect, because the attention on this issue would make it socially unacceptable for employers to be doing this. And I hope that has happened. And the reason it reminds me of unpaid internships is because these have been rife, unfortunately, in the UK. They've been rife in this place, by the way, and part of the reason that we were slow at first to make progress on getting rid of unpaid internships was that 2 groups that you often need for campaigns use them lots and lots. Politicians and the media are both usually very important for campaigns on issues. Both were using lots of unpaid internships. And when you looked across our professions, media, fashion, lots of other things, you found people working for no money. Now, what those employers would say is they were providing a great opportunity because people in those positions were getting skills that they would need later in the workplace. But the fact is, to do an unpaid internship, you've got to have a number of things that let you do that. One of those things is usually having to move to London because they're concentrated in London. You need accommodation for that. And you're doing work for that employer, so you need money from somewhere. You're either working 2 jobs then, one you're paid for and one you're not, or, which was often happening, it's the wealthiest families who can support their children doing those that are supplementing that. Those internships then lead to jobs, and then those jobs look very unrepresentative of the country as a whole because of who's getting into them. Again, a small proportion of employers doing these things, but because we shone a light on it in the way that we are with this legislation, and making it clear that actually it isn't acceptable for employers to be taking the tips of their staff, you hope that employers have already started to change their practices. But nonetheless, this legislation is very important, and I'm glad that we are bringing it in as we speak. The second issue it reminded me, though, of is access to cash. And this has already been touched on in people's speeches already. But we have this big challenge in the country at the moment about access to cash. We have banks that are closing their branches all over the country. We have cash points disappearing. We have an assumption that everybody wants to do everything by card or they want to do everything online. And I get quite a number of constituents write to me, as I'm sure we all do. I get quite a number of constituents who write to me really concerned about this because they really like to be able to use cash. They worry it's going to disappear. They don't know what they're going to do about it. And the reason this is relevant to this TIPS bill is because we've had the odd voice in the hospitality industry say that this bill is not a good thing, that there are cost pressures on the hospitality industry at the moment, that when people pay on card, the business is incurring fees for that card transaction, and therefore it's not right to let all the money go. I mean, their basic argument is they might tip on card, I'm paying money for that charge, and you're saying I've got to give the entire thing to the staff. And I'm afraid I'm hugely sympathetic to the hospitality industry in lots of ways. I'm not sympathetic to that particular point. But I do think it relates to access to cash. And we could all, by the way, do a better job of carrying cash. I mean, there's a national issue of how we ensure people who need it always have access to it. But we should all probably, to my honourable friend and member for Watford's point about this, do I need to have cash to ensure that this person's going to get their tip? Well, no, as a result of this legislation. However, they might nonetheless appreciate it. And I'm afraid that where a place has become card only, I really don't agree with that. I accept it may be simpler for people to pay card, and particularly younger generations. I don't want to make any age-related comments because I know plenty of people in their 70s and 80s who like using contactless. But I do think that we could all do a better job of carrying cash so that tips could be paid in them and received in them. But one way or the other, this is a hugely important bill. I congratulate the member for Innismore and for Watford for the work that he did on this before. And I do think, although it's a small minority, we're doing a very important thing here to make sure that people are rewarded for the effort that they put in.
Saxby.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend, the member for Wantage, who made so many important points. And it's also I'd like to pay thanks to my honourable friends for Innismore and Watford for their bill relay on getting this here today and the work that's gone on behind the scenes. And I welcome this bill and its progress through the House. And along with many others, I am disappointed by reports of companies keeping tips or portions of tips for themselves instead of passing them on to their staff as they should. And I'm confident that for the 19% of people in North Devon employed by the hospitality sector, that this will be a welcome piece of legislation. North Devon is home to fantastic hospitality businesses. Each year, we welcome over 6 million visitors who come to enjoy our beautiful coastline and countryside. We love visitors coming to our area and take pride in showing off our stunning scenery, beaches and delicious local produce. The hospitality sector is vital to our local economy, bringing in £560 million a year and supporting 11,100 local jobs. In fact, it's difficult to find a business that is not in some way reliant on tourism. The hospitality sector is key for residents of North Devon to benefit financially from our visitors and subsequently protect our world-class natural environment. Without functioning businesses, it would be unfeasible for our communities to continue protecting our natural world. From our brilliant Brend hotels to the Lynmouth Bay Cafe and the glorious Oyster in Instow, as well as all the other fantastic hospitality businesses in North Devon that I haven't time to mention today. The hospitality sector is working hard to ensure that North Devon remains a world-class destination. Reliable staffing is key to a successful hospitality business, and the majority of businesses in the hospitality sector support their staff by distributing any tips appropriately. However, median hourly pay in hospitality is the lowest of all sectors in the UK. It is estimated that the average daily value of tips is £29 outside of London for a full-time worker, and that adds up to roughly £6,500 a year. This pay is crucial to many, and in popular areas such as mine, a welcome addition to people facing higher house prices and rents as a result of North Devon's popularity as a tourism destination, which is driving our current housing crisis. It is also unfair to other hospitality businesses, especially at a time of rising energy and food costs, that some unscrupulous operators are able to gain a competitive advantage by keeping a portion of tips or service charges for the business rather than giving to the staff as customers clearly intended. Given the rise of the automatically added 12.5% service charges, this bill brings welcome clarification that tips are for the staff and not for the business. Tips are there to thank staff for their top quality service. It is important that conscientious waiters, bartenders, chefs and everyone that works to put delicious food and drinks in front of us are recognised. Customers are quite rightly horrified at reports businesses taking that money for themselves. The decline of cash has also made it easier for businesses to claim tip money as their own. As more people use cards for the majority of their transactions, tips are tied into the same receipt and have to be processed either at the till or as part of regular counts. Unlike with cash, cards take tips away from the staff on the floor and reduce transparency. Even this week, in what I had previously considered a reputable pizza chain near this house, a waiter asked for a cash tip. And as I have already said, hospitality is essential to our economy back home in North Devon. And unfortunately, many hospitality businesses are struggling to find staff. This has significant knock-on effects with the level of service businesses can provide and ultimately how much money they can make. Making jobs in hospitality more attractive is vital to my local businesses, and protecting workers' rights to the tips left by customers will make this sector a more viable option. I welcome this bill and the reassurance it gives to people working in the hospitality sector, and hope it will encourage more to enter this vital sector. Thank you once again to my honourable friends, the members for Watford and Innismon, and I'm delighted to be supporting this bill today.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Obviously thank intensely the member for Innismore for bringing the bill, and the member for Watford for all the tremendous work that was done beforehand. And as has been said several times already, it's just such an important thing, and it's really delightful that you've been able to put the time and commitment in to get it to the stage that it's at now. And I hope your heart can stop fluttering soon, Dave. Sorry, the member for Watford. And of course, it's always a pleasure to follow the member for North Devon. I think, as I said earlier on the previous bill that I didn't have much experience of, I have a little bit more experience of this one. That I do have 240 square miles in the Sedgefield constituency. There are a significant number of pubs and restaurants and hotels. I don't, unfortunately, have a great deal of awareness of apart from the odd visit of the nail bars and others, from as to what the quality of service is. Just the engagement with the teams maybe, but that's about as far as I've taken it on this one. I think it's fair to say that anyone paying a service charge or giving a tip, as we would normally refer to it as, expects that goes to the staff. I think one of the things that is important in this discussion is to understand who the staff are. That if you have a multinational hotel and the owners are very clearly distant in where they are, if you get into a lot of the pubs in particular and small restaurants, the staff can actually be the owners. And there's a differentiation there that there might be there could be one person in the family that owns it, and maybe he shouldn't be getting the tips or she shouldn't be getting the tips. but the other one could be working behind the bar or serving the food or whatever, and clearly in the distribution model of how we make this up, it has to be fair for them as well as to where it is. I mean, certainly a number of pubs either start or evolve as quasi-restaurants because the owner's the chef. You know, and they've put the effort into the kitchen, and they're providing the service of food. And you know, when we're looking at what generates a tip, well, particularly in a food environment, there's two very clear dimensions. You know, one of which is the actual quality of the food that you're getting, and the other one is the actual person-to-person service of the delivery. And it's important that all of that's considered. Well, of course.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way on that point. And I think one of the key components of this bill actually is what comes afterwards, on the hope that we get it through today and the Lords agree with us. There's a key component which is about a code of practice. And that code of practice effectively will set out, I believe it's a 12-week, unless things have changed, but a 12-week consultation. That consultation will with hospitality and more broadly to make sure that there are scenarios that will be practicable and work in reality for organisations and for staff, so that those scenarios can then be referred to as part of tribunal, should it get to that point. But hopefully it will also give lots of approaches for businesses, even before this becomes law, to say, actually, this is the right way to do it. So what this bill it doesn't do is try and do a one-size-fits-all. It's about making sure it works, but at the heart of that, absolute heart of it, is fairness. So if the tip is for people who've served you wonderful food and cooked that wonderful food, and the fairness within that organisation is to make sure that that's shared fairly across them all, then fairness will be at the heart of that, and they can refer to that code of practice as part of it.
I thank the member for Waterford for his very valuable intervention and clarification as to the direction of travel that we hope that this bill proceeds in. I just want to come back to points that were raised earlier as well. This is not about, it's about making sure people are fairly paid. We've seen this in the past, which I think is one of the drivers for this bill, of people trying to incorporate the tips as being part of a justification of a minimum wage, which is totally and wholly inappropriate. And it reinforces the position that people therefore can make sure that they get an appropriate pay on their pay slip for their work, and then this is a separate scenario that can be discussed, debated, and follow through. I think what we've got to factor in is different considerations as well, as to where people have got to, where organisations have got to. I don't think there's been many sectors of our economy that's been harder hit than the hospitality one over the last few years, and in terms of with the whole COVID scenario and what's gone on, and then subsequently the problems of labour force and this, and that puts pressures on business. And unfortunately, some businesses therefore take a step to the side as to where their morals should or could be. And I think that this bill will help to put some clarity into that space, so that it's very absolutely definitely clear that the tips belong on one side of the equation. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, that you don't find businesses who are competing with each other, where one's taking the tips and actually putting them into the profit pot or the cost recovery pot, whichever way you want to say it, as opposed to the other one who's doing the right thing and passing those monies on to where it belongs. I think just again coming back to another point that was raised earlier about the cash only or the contactless only methods of payment. I think one side benefit of this bill is it provides clarity that the method of payment is not an influencer on whether somebody gets the tip. I think we've all been to organisations when we've walked through the door, obviously not in my constituency, as the member said earlier, it must have been when I was travelling somewhere, where it says contactless card payment only, or it would say cash payment only. And I think any customer walking in where the organisation is putting that direction on, it makes you think there's an ulterior motive. Is the organisation wanting it as cash so that it doesn't always go through the books? is the organisation wanting to contactless only so they've got control of all the tips or things? You know, there's the two extremes. Both are probably unfounded thought processes for most organisations that you go into, but it puts a doubt into the customer's mind as to what their motives are and things like that. And I think the processing of this bill, hopefully, will take that uncertainty away from the customer, and the customer can know that the right things are being done, and there's no impact from the whole the TIPS agenda. I think it's when you look at these things, it's so many typically small organisations that are affected by this, and the aggregation up of the number of people that are affected is just incredible. You know, I understand that you could see up to 1 million people that could be seen to benefit by this, and the stats I saw implied that this was about £200 a year each. Now, whilst £200 a year each is significant, just like the Honourable Member mentioned earlier, I would like to think that I tip reasonably, and I would like to think that the people I see getting tipped should aggregate significantly more than £200 a year over the year. So I think it can very easily be a very significant benefit for the people that are providing the excellent service in our organisations, and I'm really commending the progress of this bill. The member mentioned earlier that he would also try to be in as many of his pubs and places as he could. I do the same. Sometimes, if the House will excuse me, just a slight digression on this, there are unintended consequences. I don't think that I'm a particularly heavy drinker. Clearly, when I'm going out, and there'll be no alcohol in those places, but we all have a couple of beers from time to time. I don't know whether people saw, but there was a Love Your Liver campaign in the House earlier this week. I called in there, and I'm now going to my GP because apparently I need to be checked up. So when we are going out on these sort of things, be aware of your health, be aware of the impacts of things like that. You couldn't possibly, don't necessarily know. I don't think there's anything wrong with me. The scan tells me there could be. You need to check it out. So it's just be aware of those sort of things. So I apologise for the digression, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but it just seemed as an appropriate time to put out a little shout out for that health agenda. I do really appreciate the intent of the bill in terms of it all being about fairness, and it just takes away the need and the need for concern, and it gives the employees this legal right to go back and check if it's necessary. And the final point I'd like to put onto this discussion really is just an endorsement of what was the other point that was made earlier about the potential to publicise this as we move forward and make sure that both the staff and employers are really aware that this is now a line in the sand which has a legal footprint behind it and isn't just something that is seen as best practice. And of course, best practice attests to best staff. The best staff will attract customers. Anybody that has worked in any organisation, any manufacturing business, any trading business, any sales business, knows one thing above all else. The easiest customers are the repeat customers. And if you can repeat your customers, then you will have a much more successful business. You will have a business that is more sustainable. Why do customers come? It goes back to what I said earlier. It comes from either the quality of the product, typically food in the common things we're talking about, food or drink, and the quality of the service. If you look after your staff, you look after your people, and you pay them correctly and allow them to keep the tips that they've earned, then you will have a much more successful business. And I commend this bill to the House.
Simon Bayes.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And it is a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Sedgefield. And also, I too would like to pay tribute to my fellow Welsh Conservative Member of Parliament, the Honourable Member for Ynys Môn, and my friend and fellow Member of Parliament, the Honourable Member for Watford. They, as was mentioned with respect to the previous private member's bill that we were debating, there is a huge amount of work that goes into this. And I know both my colleagues are extremely hard-working and intelligent people, and it's therefore not a surprise to me that they brought this forward, this private member's bill, in a timely fashion and in very good shape. Now, I grew up in the hospitality industry. My father ran the Lake Vyrnwy Hotel in Wales, which is only a few miles south of my constituency of Clwyd South. I used to, along with my three brothers, used to work in the holidays for my father, and I've just been trying to cast my mind back to what the wage was that we were paid. And I think, and this is really a measure of how old I am, I think it was 20p an hour, which in those days was actually a very good rate of pay for a teenager. But as a... just the new money. So it wasn't 20D, it was 20p. And it's therefore the hospitality industry is always of huge interest to me, not only in my life in general, but also particularly as the Member of Parliament for Clwyd South. And as has been said by the Honourable Member for Wantage, this is not just about the hospitality industry. I fully appreciate that, but it is really the key sector when we come to consider this bill. And like the Honourable Member for Ynys Môn, Clwyd South too is an area of great tourism and hospitality businesses. And indeed, at exactly this time, a week ago, Mr Deputy Speaker, I was visiting Tyndwr Hall Hotel in my constituency, which is a wedding venue that lies just outside Llangollen. And I was talking to Tracy Owen, whose family own and she runs the business. And one of the points that came up in that discussion, and again it's been touched on by other members today, is the vital importance of bringing on young people into the hospitality industry. And the hospitality industry, as I remember in my own case many, many years ago, is a wonderful training ground for young people to learn a skill and also to learn some discipline in terms of turning up for work on time, doing a job properly and so on. And I think there are many, many hospitality industries, and Tyndwr Hall Hotel is a very good example, who go out of their way to bring on young people, as in sixth form or whatever, to do holiday work and learn a skill. And there are many other businesses in my constituency, such as Iscoed Park, which is another wedding venue, the Sun Inn Trevor, a very popular pub, the Hand Hotel and Chirk, and Café Wilver, which is a social enterprise cafe, the Hand at Llanarmon, the Boat at Herbistock, Corn Mill in Llangollen, and Gale's Wine Bar, which was famously often frequented by the former Prime Minister, the member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, when he was the parliamentary candidate for Clwyd South back in 1997. The Three Eagles, the Cambridge Hotel in Llangollen, and finally the Wild Pheasant. There are many, many more I could mention, and it's probably invidious to pick out some and not speak of all, but those are just a few that spring to mind. They're businesses that I've visited and know well. And at the visit I made to the Wild Pheasant at Llangollen, again, they made the point about actually recruiting young people into the industry. And I think at a time when Brexit and brought changes to the employment market, it's actually offered opportunities to people who perhaps wouldn't have gone out to work at a young age in quite the way that they are now. But it's also turbocharged those businesses to actually get out there, bring people in, train them up, and give them a good job. So I think that's a very important background to this discussion, because it is, of course, as has been mentioned by many people, often the younger people who are serving in these hospitality industries and are therefore the focus of this bill. Now, like the Honourable Member for Wantage, I too was pretty astonished that there are currently no laws which directly concern the distribution of tips as between employers and their workers. And in terms of legal ownership, tips and gratuities which are paid directly to the employer are presently the legal property of the employer. This is also the case for all service charges. I think it's worth repeating those words because they are pretty extraordinary, really, when you come to think about it. And therefore that makes the basis of this bill all the more important. And the retention of the tips is a very complicated issue. Now, I would say, like other members present here, there isn't a particular problem in my constituency of Clwyd South. But my elder daughter has been working in various hospitality places in London, and she studied international hospitality management at university. And she says to us that the problem is rife in a lot of hospitality places, restaurants and so on. So I think the idea that this is, a sort of limited problem probably isn't the case. And therefore, I think that, again, is why it's so important that we have this bill. Now, obviously, the concern was addressed in the National Minimum Wage Regulations 1999 Amendment, Regulations 2009, which included a provision stating that such sums could no longer be used to make up the national minimum wage. But they didn't address the wider issue of unfair retention and distribution. And I strongly support the purpose of this bill to create a legal obligation on employers across sectors to allocate all tips, gratuities and service charges in the way this has been described. And I think another key point in this discussion is also the way in which it is distributed, because the bill also intends to increase fairness for employers who already allocate all tips to workers by ensuring that all employers follow the same rules and by preventing a return to further unfair tipping practices in the future. So yes, you can hand the tips to the employees, but if you don't make the distribution amongst the employees fair, then you still haven't fully solved the problem. And employers would be required to regard a new statutory code of practice when complying with their obligation to allocate tips fairly. I think that, again, is absolutely vital in this. And I think, too, that two other points that have been made by people who are experts in this industry. The first is by Michael Kill, the CEO of the Nighttime Industries Association. And he said, at a time when the hospitality industry is dealing with record vacancy levels, attracting people into work in hospitality businesses already difficult enough. Taking tips off staff at a time when the cost of living is going up and the potential external economic pressures on our staff need to be considered. So that is a fundamental point to this. And then really my last point, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would say is with reference to Kate Nichols, the Chief Executive of the industry body UK Hospitality, who is known to many people in this House and does a fantastic job in acting as an ambassador for the UK hospitality industry. And I may pay tribute to her during the COVID pandemic, when she did more than perhaps any other representative of that industry to bring the concerns of the hospitality industry to the government with fruitful results. And she has made the point, and I do think this is an important balancing point, she's urged the government to work closely with businesses and employees to make the system work for all. As she said, venues faced mounting costs. And to quote, for hospitality businesses, though, customers tipping with a card incurs bank charges for the business, and many also employ external partners to ensure tips are fairly distributed among staff. So I think that's an important balancing point that we need to consider. But in conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as somebody who is born and bred in the hotel business, I have nothing but support for this tremendous bill, and I commend it to the House.
James Grundy.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to commend my honourable friends, the members for Innismore and the member for Watford, for their work on this, what I think is a very important bill. And it's also a pleasure to follow the member for Clwyd South in his what I thought was an excellent speech. And actually, with some irony, I actually am going to, as I mentioned the last time we were in private members sitting Friday before, I mentioned my grandmother, who of course is from Chirk in my honourable friend's constituency. And it was actually in that part of the world where I learned approximately 40 years ago what a tip was, because we regularly went to Llandudno on holiday, which is a lovely seaside town, and we were in the tea rooms close to the seafront, and my grandmother had left 50 pence on the side of her teacup. And I said, well, what are you doing, Grandma? And she said to me, well, this is what's known as a tip, because I was about 5 years old at the time. And she said, and I said, well, what is a tip? And she said to me, Well, it's a token of thanks to the member of staff who served you. It's not a payment for the services or the food you've been provided. It's thanking them for going above and beyond in the service they have given to you. And I think that's tremendously important to recognise that, as many colleagues have said today, and of course it's banned with respect to the minimum wage, that tips are not there to make up wages. And they're not there for other purposes either. They are, as I've said before, it is a token of thanks. And it's not a means of making up income. I think it's very important that we recognise that that is an entirely separate matter. And I've always felt that people who work in those sorts of industries where people receive tips, and of course, I think this was brought up before. My friend, the honourable member for Wantage, with regards to America. In America, and I still remember the scene from, as many of you will, from Reservoir Dogs, where one of the main characters, one of the misters, as it were, was asked for a tip at the end of a scene in a cafe, and he quite famously says, "I don't tip." And then there's a huge argument around the table about the culture of tipping in America, saying, well, if you don't tip, then how are these waitresses going to manage? How is this fair? And I always thought that was a very unusual scene because certainly at the time that film came out, I think basically people would have certainly felt the tips should go to the staff, but they would have considered it pretty unpleasant, the idea that tips were needed to make up the wages of staff, even then. And of course that is why British people on going to America are regarded as absolutely terrible tippers, because we don't see it as a means of making up wages. We see it as a token. And of course in America I believe that the bare minimum you should consider tipping is, I believe, 10%. Oh, I could be wrong. That could it's 15. Well, thank you to my honourable friend, the member for Wantage, for clarifying that. I'm afraid I've never been to America. I hope to take the opportunity to do so. And I do think there is a difference as well between and my friend the honourable member for Watford spoke about this briefly earlier on. I do think there is a difference between a tip and a service charge. I think it's important to consider them slightly differently, for the main reason that a tip is often voluntary, because if simply you think you've received bad service, you don't leave a tip. So a tip is something that you are giving to the individual who has served you for their particular service. And it's a token of thanks to them individually. Whereas a service charge obviously is disbursed to, or should be, as the honourable member said, to the staff as a whole, and sometimes a service charge isn't voluntary; it appears on the bill, and it's something that that isn't a personal choice. So I think there should be a distinction there in terms of that. I also think, with regards to that, and this is something that we haven't talked about, and I'll talk about it very briefly, with regards to. And I know the honourable member for Watford has said further work is going to be done on this. I think this is something I hope they will consider. I think the taxation of tips, or the potential taxation of tips, should be different from that of a service charge. I think that should be given some consideration, because a tip is, of course, in effect, a gift, and gifts are taxed differently. Whereas the service charge, I think, could be considered in a slightly different manner. I do realise that is a slightly esoteric point, and I understand that it is so esoteric that it may not have been considered in this debate or during the provisions. I will quite happily give way.
I'll be very brief, because I know you haven't got much time. Just on taxation, it's wholly separate from this bill. So the bill is very much about bays and within that space. So what the bill will not do is change anything on taxation, just to give him some reassurance.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his clarification on that point, and I think on that basis I've covered most of the points I wish to cover in my contribution to this debate. We've heard a number of, I think, very sensible, very reasonable contributions from colleagues today. I think this is something that has overwhelming crossbench support. I think that this legislation is long overdue, but it is terribly sad, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we are looking at having to legislate to deal with this. I think it's pretty cheap for businesses to try and take tips for themselves. It's my view that those were always meant for the staff, and as I say, a token of thanks to people for service above and beyond what should be expected. And with that, Mr Deputy Speaker, I shall sit down.
Philip.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, as is often the case on days like this, one prepares a very extensive speech and then one is given guidance that one should be brief. I shall therefore seek to rattle through a number of points relatively quickly and try to be as helpful to the Minister as I can be. So I'm just interested in the explanatory notes. As you probably know already, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we had a public consultation on this in 2013. There was another consultation in 2016. There was another response to the consultation in 2021, and now we're in 2023. I mean, good Lord, 8 years. Why has it taken so long? A number of colleagues have noted there's no law on this, but in, again, the explanatory notes, point 15, it says, in terms of legal ownership, tips and gratuities which are paid directly to the employer are presently the legal property of the employer. It then goes on to say that tips and gratuities which are paid in cash directly to a worker are the legal property of the worker. And a number of MPs have mentioned, colleagues have mentioned about this transition from cash to card, and I'm just interested in the Minister's view about what the implications are in terms of legal ownership and whether this bill particularly assists or not. I looked at, as of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the impact assessment, and I was interested that it referred to the possibility for complaints to be made to the Employment Tribunal as a result of this, these changes, this legislation. And I'd just be interested if the Minister or his team have any assessment about what the impact of this is likely to be. I would guess it's limited and perfunctory, but we know that employment tribunals are under a lot of pressure to get through pieces of work, and so it'd just be helpful to dot the I's and cross the T's on that one. I was also interested in Table 12, if I can draw the Minister's attention to that, on page 26 of the impact assessment, where it looks at the summary of costs by business size and central estimate. There is no greater champion in this House for small businesses than the Minister himself, and so he will have noted that the distribution between micro, small, medium and large businesses, rather than showing a nice graduated increase in costs where the largest amount of cost is on the largest businesses, does show that there's quite a lot of costs on the very smallest of businesses as a result of compliance with these regulations. So I'd be interested in his thoughts on that. I would like to thank the honourable members for Watford and Esmond for proposing this bill and supporting this bill in reverse things. But I thought I would end with some questions to the Minister directly about his approach to tips, which, speaking from the dispatch box, with his hand on the dispatch box, he may wish to advise the House. My first would be, does the Minister tip or not? My second question is, how much does the Minister routinely tip? I'd like to ask the Minister if he's ever been out for a meal and someone's offered to pay for the meal, does he offer to pay the tip?
Will you give way on that point?
I'm happy to give way on that point.
I just wanted to know if the honourable member is speaking from personal experience of the Minister when he poses that question.
Sadly, the Minister's never bought me a free lunch at all, but that is no disparaging character. Does the Minister pay a tip if it's automatically applied to the bill? If the automatic charge, this is actually a serious point, so the other ones I think are a little frivolous. This is a serious point. If the automatic charge is a service charge, does the Minister pay a tip in addition? And this is important because there's a lot of confusion. Is a service charge actually a tip or not? I don't think it is. I still don't know if it's covered by this legislation. Can the Minister, or has the Minister, ever crossed out a service charge on a bill and not paid it? And does the Minister ever dare not to pay a tip? Now, the Minister may choose to give the government's response on all those matters rather than the personal response, but I did want to get those questions on the record. And in the interest of time, Mr Deputy Speaker, I will end my comments there.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I congratulate the Honourable Member for Innismore and the Member for Watford for all their work on bringing this bill. It will make such a difference to so many people across the country. I'd like to declare an interest at this stage and say it will make a difference for two of my older children who are working in and out of the hospitality industry and are very interested in the progress of this bill. And also this is righting a wrong of many decades. When I was a waitress in a hotel, I had to drive home at the end of my shift, and I was the most junior member of staff. All of the rest of the staff lived in the hotel and would drink the tips at the end of every night. So I wouldn't get any of those tips. I wasn't able to ask my employer really for any kind of written write-up of the policy on tips. I wasn't able to find out what happened and what my contribution per part of that would be. And so it was just an injustice that I felt for quite a long time, and I'm glad that this bill will be here to right many injustices that are happening on a daily basis across the country. I support rewarding customer service and transparency and confidence for businesses, for customers and for employees alike. This is more fair for businesses that do the right thing. It's more fair for people who tip and expect it to go to the worker, and as has been said by many members, there's a lot of things that aren't clear about that at the moment. I hope that it will be much more clear in future, and it's more fair for the employee who will get the money that has been given by customers for the work that they have done. Labour will be supporting this bill, and I'm pleased to see that the government are behind it as well, with the support of unions, especially the GMB, who've been campaigning on this for a long time, and UK Hospitality. And like other members, I'm surprised that there is no law on tips at the moment. However, this is a measure that should have been in a comprehensive employment bill, as I have raised in a previous debate, and that has been promised time and time again by government. It is disgraceful for all this time hospitality workers and workers in the beauty industry have been cheated out of their money, because it's clear that some hospitality workers are not getting their tips, with companies instead using these to subsidise other workers' wages, or to pay for accidents like unpaid customer bills, or to pay for so-called administration costs that are very opaque. In 2015, evidence was found that 2/3 of employers in hospitality were making deductions from staff tips, in some cases of 10%. With the pandemic, and with more people paying by card, not cash, there are very founded concerns that incidents of workers not receiving tips in full is becoming standard practice. So this law is very timely. The government have repeatedly promised to tackle this issue, but failed to do so up to now. They published a call for evidence in 2013, which had broad support for actions on fair tipping. They then promised this would be in the Conservative Party conference in 2018, the 2019 Conservative Manifesto, and committed to include it in the Employment Bill in December 2019, but this was dropped from the last two Queen's speeches. In the meantime, the latest figures suggest that staff may have lost over £1 billion of tips while waiting for this legislation over the last 5 years, Mr Deputy Speaker. Frontline workers in pubs, bars, cafes, restaurants, hairdressers, beauty salons are often the lowest paid. With the Tories' cost of living crisis worsening by the week, every penny counts, and we desperately need this legislation. We saw in 2020 that Unite members at the Ivy tried to lodge a collective grievance against their employer on a number of issues, including withholding tips. But with no formally legally backed process to take the complaint forward, this was dismissed. And I thank the member for Reading East for his speech highlighting how important this bill will be for so many of his constituents, especially for the hospitality sector and for students, and I would agree with that. I'm proud that it was a Labour government which in 2009 first intervened in this issue to make it illegal for tips to contribute to the national minimum wage, just as I am proud that for some years before it was a Labour government which introduced the national minimum wage itself. Yes?
she's right to congratulate the previous Labour government on introducing the national minimum wage, and would she also be grateful and notify the fact that it is good news, isn't it? The last 3 years. Today, the National Minimum Wage Low Pay Commission report details have been produced, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and this shows that for young people between 2019 and 2022, they had the largest increase in their wages over that period, 25% increase for 16 and 17-year-olds compared to 11% for those over 23. Would you agree that's very good news indeed?
The increase of the national minimum wage is very good news, and I remain proud that the Labour government first brought that in and didn't drag its feet for years and years over that. Back then, too many bad bosses were using tips, which should be a voluntary extra, as has been underlined by so many members today, to top up basic pay. And once again, Labour have been ahead of the curve on this issue. My good colleague, the Shadow Secretary of State for the Future of Work, committed last year to stamp out unfair tipping practices, with many of the provisions that we're now seeing included in this bill. The allocation of all tips, gratuities and service charge payments to workers in full without deductions, having a written policy made clear to staff about how all tips are allocated, and paying those tips in full at the end of the month following the payment. Labour will ensure that tips are allocated fairly through the trunk that's genuinely independent of the business, and we will announce proposals to allow exploited workers to lodge any workplace grievances collectively, a right denied to many hospitality workers seeking return of deducted tips. A Labour government will deliver for working people, ending unjust deductions and ensuring workers themselves decide how tips are distributed. So I want to end, Mr. Deputy Speaker, by posing questions to the Minister. First, we have before us another bill about workers' rights, following the passage of the previous bill about workers' rights. If the government are going to introduce the employment bill, effectively through the support of piecemeal private members' bills such as these, which parts of the original bill, the employment bill, are they dropping? Second, many workers end up on the end of already illegal practices while at work. Without stronger enforcement of standards, there's a real risk of bills such as this failing to meet their potential. I thank the Minister for his earlier response about the consultation on a single enforcement body. Does the Minister believe a single enforcement body for workers' rights will help to enhance people's ability to get justice against unscrupulous employers? And third, measures to strengthen the rights of hospitality workers are welcome. But ONS statistics from May this year show that nearly 25% of workers in the food and accommodation sectors are on 0-hour contracts. Hospitality workers desperately need security and flexibility. So will the Minister commit today to banning these one-sided, unfair 0-hour contracts? I will close by congratulating the Honourable Member for Innismore for getting this bill so far. It's going to have a massive impact. It has our support, and I wish her the very best in the remaining stages. Thank you.
Kevin Hollenrake.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I first also, like the Shadow Minister, declare my interest. I have 2 young daughters who may benefit from this legislation, who work in the hospitality sector. So I should declare that interest, but happily I'm pleased to say it would also benefit around 1 million other people to the tune of £200 million per annum. Can I thank, obviously, the member for Innismore, I think it's pronounced Innismore, we've had some problems with constituency pronunciations, I think this morning, but Innismore, for her very hard work in bringing this bill forward to the 3rd reading. This bill is about fairness and transparency, and about, again, our efforts to make this society a fairer one. I'm very pleased she's taken the sponsorship of this bill. I would also obviously like to thank the previous sponsor for the bill, the member for Watford, for his work on such an important piece of legislation, and his campaigning on this, of course. It's not just the work in taking the bill forward, he was amazing campaigning on it. Also my predecessors, the Honourable Member for Watford, but also my old friend, the member for Sutton and Cheam and Loughborough, of course. It has been brilliant to hear the support in this House for these measures, and I'll briefly reiterate why the government is supporting this legislation. A few years ago, stories were highlighted in the news about bosses wrongfully pocketing tips intended for their workers. The government and the public were both appalled by this. Money left by customers who wanted to recognise the hard work and excellence of staff was, in some cases, simply treated as part of the revenue of the business. That is why my department took action to understand the scale of the problem, launching consultations which has been referred to. Following this, we've been able to publish a full impact assessment to support this private member's bill. The government believes tips should go to the staff who earn them rather than the business, and that businesses who withhold tips from staff are wrongfully benefiting from money intended for hard-working staff. So this bill will prevent employers from making these deductions when distributing tips, apart from those required or permitted by existing legislation, such as under tax law. This ensures all money left by customers is passed to workers in full as intended. The bill also establishes a requirement to allocate tips fairly between workers at a place of business, and this protects vulnerable workers and prevents exploitation. As we mentioned previously, a voluntary code of practice on tipping was published in 2009. Our evidence shows that voluntary guidance alone was not enough to stamp out bad practice. This bill, therefore, goes a step further and requires employers to give consideration to a statutory code of practice when considering how tips should be distributed. The code will continue to be developed by the government in partnership with key stakeholders and will be subject to a full consultation period before the final version is brought to this House for approval. Now, if I may, I want to address some specific measures, specific points made by honourable members in this debate. The honourable member for Reading East talked about the benefits to lower income workers and to towns with lots of hospitality workers like Reading and indeed like places in Thirsk and Malton, of course, and many other constituencies that we represented here today. My honourable friend, the member for Watford, talked about snollygosters and Quentin Letts. And Quentin, I don't know actually if that particular piece referenced my honourable friend or not himself personally, which is always a badge of honour, regardless of whether those comments are derogatory or not, to get mentioned in the Quentin Letts article. But he also said, of course, this was about fairness and also clarity. And the simple question when you're handing over a tip, do you get this? And this should not be about topping up salaries. I would say it should be about, though, driving up service. These are paid to people who do a good job. I'll answer the questions for the member for North East Bedfordshire in terms of my particular tipping policy very shortly. Just in terms of burdens, one thing I would say is there are some burdens on business because of this, particularly around record keeping. So I think we should bear that in mind when we legislate, of course, but I think on balance this is fair. Again, my honourable friend, the member for Cheadle, referenced fairness in her speech, how most employers do the right thing, but some do not, and the confusion regarding cash or card payments, what will happen to them. And this is not just about hospitality, absolutely right, other industries, such as the beauty industry. I will point out, though, it doesn't cover every single sector. There is definitions, requirements in here where record keeping and the like, and the passing on of tips only applies to businesses who have who receive tips on a more than exceptional or occasional basis. So it doesn't cover every single instance, it's just where tips are routinely paid. The member for Watford, Wantage, also talked about not just being hospitality, but also the key element of access. He's there. Access to cash, which is another stream of work the government's undertaking, of course. Our friend, the member for North Devon, talked about her fantastic hospitality venues, which are essential to her economy and indeed to mine in my area. She's a huge advocate for business, like many of us who speak in this chamber, and certainly in this side of the House. We are for business because we are from business, and I know she is, and I very much welcome that. Honourable friend, the member for Sedgefield, talks about his hospitality venues. I've visited a number in Sedgefield, actually. He's not here. He's there. Not least Sedgefield Racecourse on occasions, which is always a treat. He talks about how this is actually overseen, and he talks about the instances of different, for example, sole traders. In this legislation applies to employment law, of course. It only applies to people who are employees, and the Code of Practice will go into this in more detail, of course. Honourable friend, the member for Clwyd South, born and bred in the hospitality sector, so speaks with real authority on this. Again, one thing he mentions, which probably the phrase I'll mention more than any other in my role as Minister for Business, is the words fair and level playing field. Absolutely right. That's what we seek to achieve. And also talks about the representation, such as Michael Kill from Nighttime Industries, how this is important to attract workers into that sector, and indeed the great work of Kate Nichols in the hospitality sector. I remember the member for Lee talked about this again, this being a token of thanks. Absolutely right, because that's what drives service. Honourable friend, the member for North East Bedfordshire, as always, challenges in a number of different areas. You mentioned the number of consultations we've gone through, basically telling us to get on with it. And that's what we're doing today, of course, getting this legislation through today and get it into effect as quickly as possible. He talks about employment tribunals. Will they have the capacity to deal with these issues? And indeed, that's some work that's going on across government in terms of expanding capacity within the employment tribunals. He talks about also cash card, which goes to who. Cash is by right, as he says. By right is the property of the employee, unless the employment contract says it's not. So this brings clarity in any circumstance, whether it's a service charge or not, and that is covered by this, that money will go to the employees. That's critical to this legislation. Yes, please.
I just think it'd be helpful just to put it right. So where one sees on a bill service charge, as of this bill passing, service charge, when people see it, they can say, this is covered, it counts as a tip, it will go to the employees, it's not going to other uses within the firm.
That is correct. He talks about my personal tipping, what I do in terms of what I tip. Do I tip? Yes. By standard, if there's no service charge applied, I would tip usually 10%, sometimes more, based upon performance. Sometimes I will tip nothing if I don't feel that the service has been at that level. Does I pay a tip if I don't pay the meal? I normally pay for the meal as well, actually, but I have offered to on occasion, and so yes, I think that covers all his questions. But if he has any more, we can deal with it by separate means. In terms of the Shadow Minister, again, I'll refer to my comments I said earlier in terms of employment bill, where the key thing is we're getting on with key legislation that we think is really important. It's not just this legislation, it's other pieces of legislation also, flexible working, carers leave, and others. It talks about enforcement, hugely important. Legislation without implementation is pointless. Absolutely. One of the most effective parts of our regulatory system in the UK, in my view, are employment tribunals. There is no pan-employment regulator in the UK, and when you think about it, that's quite a surprise. There are for some in some sectors, and there's 30 million people employed in this country. The employment tribunals do a fantastic job at a fraction of the cost of other regulators. It is ex-ante regulation, ex-post regulation, rather, and I think a more effective means of doing that. So employment tribunals is the mechanism principally for enforcement. It talks about zero-hours contracts. Very small proportion of people in this country are on zero-hours contracts, 2 to 3%, and many are for good reasons and want to be on zero-hours contracts. But she raises a very important point. It's something we are looking at and determined to tackle. There are some abuses of that system, and we're keen to bring forward new regulations to make sure we do tackle that area. So in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, bringing forward these new rules will protect over 2 million workers from bad bosses and give them an avenue to seek remedies. Businesses will be assured they are not being undercut by companies where bosses are keeping tips for themselves. Consumers will have increased confidence that their tips are going to the workers they are intended for. And these new rules are backed by government evidence and analysis. The government is therefore pleased to reiterate its support of this private member's bill. Wonderful to see the support in the House during today's debate. I'd just like to list the civil servants, if I may, and there's a number of them. Flora Strange, Lucy Allett, Yasna Reynolds, Mary Smith, Tony Gordon, Joe Giles, Seema Bamra, Bex Lowe, Richard Lewis, Abigail Bridger, Rachel Senior. I can see the whip moving closer to me. I'm going to... No, it's not. It's the next minister. So I'm concluding very shortly. Anthony Morris, Cora Sweet from our private office, Nadine Othman, Laura Matthews, Clara Teal, Patrick Day and Harry Ravi. Finally, I very much look forward to working with my honourable friend, the member for Unismorn, and stakeholders to support the passage of these measures as it moves to the House of Lords. And I commend this bill to the House.
And if the Minister was ever to invite us all out for dinner one night, I think we'd like to see his tipping style in action, wouldn't we? It's fascinating. With leave of the House, I call Virginia Crosby to wind up.
With the leave of this House as the Member of Parliament for Unismorn, I would like to thank all honourable members for their contributions today, and I'd particularly like to emphasise the work of my honourable friend from Watford and thank him for his kind words. He also taught us a new word today, snolligostas. We heard about workers' rights, and really he emphasised us working together as a House. The member from Reading East talked about the importance of this bill for university towns like Reading. The wonderful member for Cheadle mentioned a campaign to make sure people know about this and how we've amended the 1996 Employment Act. The member for Wantage waxed lyrical about Christmas tips and all his pubs and how he plans to visit them. The member for North Devon, we had a fantastic romp through her constituency, all the fantastic places to visit and eat. The member for Sedgefield highlighted how important it is that this bill will help businesses look after their staff. The member for Clwyd South, my colleague there, growing up in the Lake Vyrnwy Hotel. It's a wonderful, wonderful hotel. He particularly paid tribute to Kate Nichols. The member for Lee, we had a great image of Reservoir Dogs scene and the culture of tipping in the US. The member for North East Bedfordshire, my dog sends her best wishes, talked about impact assessments and small businesses. And lastly, the Shadow Minister for Putney shared her experiences of not being able to drink her tips and the significance of the support of unions and UK hospitality. I would like to end by thanking the Minister for signalling the Government's continued support for this bill, and I hope honourable members on all sides of the House can agree that this is an essential piece of legislation which will help to promote fairness and transparency to ensure that workers receive the tips they earn. I commend this bill to the House.
Yeah. The question is that the bill be now read the third time. As Mayor Larkin say, aye? Aye. Don't you know? I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Congratulations, Virginia Crosby and Dean Russell.